October 1917, and the guns on the Western Front had been firing for 3 years. To the troops in the trenches it seemed as if the war would last forever, a nightmare of machines against men. But on the 15th of October 1917, all eyes were focused on the grim fortress of Vincennes near Paris, and on one woman who was to be executed there. Mata Hari, the spy said to have used sex to secure vital military secrets from Germany. Nearly 80 years after her death, Mata Hari remains the 20th century's most powerful icon of female betrayal. Her career as an exotic dancer and as a spy was surrounded by myths created by herself and the men who finally destroyed her. But was Mata Hari ever a spy? Or was she innocent of the crimes with which she was charged at a military tribunal held in the darkest days of the First World War? Was Mata Hari the spy who never was? Mata Hari was born plain Margarethe Zeller in the provincial Dutch town of Leeuwarden in 1876. Her upbringing was comfortable, conventional and bourgeois. Her father Adam was a hatter, sufficiently important to join the Guard of Honor when the Dutch royal family visited his hometown. For a while, the Zeller family prospered. But it broke up when Adam Zeller went bankrupt, leaving the young Margarethe to be farmed out to live with a succession of relatives in The Hague. Nearby was the beach resort of Scheveningen, a favorite haunt of officers on leave from the Dutch colonies in the East Indies. Margarethe loved men in uniform. She was to meet one of them at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam in 1895. It was a fateful encounter. He was Rudolph MacLeod, an army officer of Scottish descent who had spent 10 hard years in the colonies. He was looking for a wife, but at 38 he was twice the age of the lovely young woman to whom he quickly proposed. Margarethe married MacLeod 4 months after their first meeting. Soon afterwards she joined her husband in Sumatra. In the sultry heat of the East Indies, the marriage rapidly broke down. Margarethe tried to live the life of an officer's wife, but the lush and colourful surroundings of Sumatra stirred a strong sensual streak within her, driving her middle-aged husband to fits of jealous rage. Margarethe was fascinated by the way the women of Sumatra harnessed dance and song, whether working in the fields or dressed for the more intricate and erotic rituals of court and religion. The grace and symbolism of their movements planted a seed in the young European woman's mind. It was here, in the sultry heat of the tropics, that the legend of Mata Hari was born. Then tragedy intervened. Margarethe's small daughter and her son were struck by food poisoning. The boy survived, but the little girl died. Margarethe left her husband and sailed for Europe. She settled in Paris. The mellow stone of Notre Dame was a long way from the jungles of Sumatra. This was the Paris of the Belle Époque. Above all, it was the city of the courtesans. Dubbed les Grandes Horizontales, these languid beauties used their lovers not only to acquire wealth, but also to wield social and sometimes political power. Show business and sex were the keys to fame and fortune. It was part of the natural order of things in France. A man might attend his wife in the morning, but in the afternoon he visited his mistress. In this heady atmosphere, Margarethe Zeller reinvented herself as an exotic oriental dancer. Drawing on her experiences in the colonies, she developed a westernized version of the temple dances she had watched in Sumatra. Armed with breastplates and the bogus title of Lady MacLeod, she passed herself off as the native East Indian wife of an English aristocrat. Later she became Mata Hari, which in Malay means Eye of the Day. As Mata Hari, she instantly touched a raw erotic nerve. She quickly became a star. She relied on semi-nudity and the support of sympathetic journalists and society hostesses. One of the hostesses was the American Natalie Baum.
She was a dark beauty with a very beautiful figure. But to my remembrance, she lacked charm. And I preferred her war dances to her more exotic performances, which were the beginning of the striptease. I think she was very vain of herself and wanted to produce herself as much as she could. In fact, she produced herself too much at the end. She should have realized the dangers she was in. She lived dangerously.
Mata Hari continually refashioned her life history to fit new circumstances. Few questioned the stories she told about herself. But she was already spinning a web of fiction in which eventually she would be trapped. If Margareta Zeller could invent a whole new life to launch herself as a star, so others could invent an imaginary past to destroy her. By 19, Mata Hari was one of the highest paid dancers in Europe. She had joined the ranks of the Grande Horizontale. Great musical figures courted her. Puccini sent his personal congratulations after watching one of Mata Hari's performances. The composer of the ballet Puccini had seen, the 65-year-old Jules Massenet, avidly pursued her. Rich and powerful lovers came and went, showering her with money, furs and houses. Mata Hari was now a leading society figure. Her reputation as an insatiable man-eater provoked a mixture of admiration and envy. High-ranking members of the military were Mata Hari's favorite escorts. She had developed a taste for the company of officers long before her marriage, but her exalted status now ensured that she could take generals into her bed. But rank was no guarantee of Mata Hari's favors. She declared that she would rather sleep with a poor officer than a rich banker. On her first visit to Berlin, a city she cordially hated, Mata Hari sought out the men in uniform. The lover she found was a young army officer and amateur pilot, Lieutenant Kiebut. He took her to watch the Imperial Army on maneuvers in Silesia. It was an innocent enough outing, but at Mata Hari's trial in 1917, this excursion was dredged up as evidence that the dancer was a spy. Back in Paris, she discovered to her dismay that her supremacy was threatened by a small army of imitators. They were younger, and their costumes were even more revealing than those worn by the exotic original. Mata Hari left Paris to score a triumph in one of the greatest operas in the world, La Scala in Milan, where she appeared in an opera by Gluck. In the same season, she created a sensation in a ballet by scorning a blonde wig for the role of Venus and dancing in her own dark hair. Then, at a private party in Rome, she achieved a long-held ambition by dancing as Salome to Richard Strauss's music. In August 1914, Mata Hari was in Berlin. She was broke. Her figure was thickening, and 40 was looming. So was war. Millions of men were on the move in a mobilization that could not be reversed. Mata Hari was for behind enemy lines. The French cried, "To Berlin," the Germans to Paris. The Germans came closer to victory but in the scorching summer heat, their advance on Paris broke down. Soon a war of movement became a war of artillery and fixed positions. The first trenches appeared. From the English Channel to Switzerland, the front line was frozen. In what became known as the Zone of the Armies, the destruction mounted. By 1915, the casualties were already being measured in millions. Into the French rear passed a flood of refugees. Some of them were thought to be spies. The war had cut Mata Hari off from her house and possessions in Paris. She left Germany for her native Holland, which was a neutral country. In The Hague, she reached a comfortable financial arrangement with one of her old lovers, the Baron Edouard van der Capellen, who gave her a house and a generous allowance. On the Western Front in 1915, living conditions were less agreeable. Soldiers struggled through a landscape dominated by mud and water-filled shell holes. In places so deep that men and mules drowned in it. Both sides waited for a breakthrough that never came. It was a war dominated by the machine gun and the spade. Meanwhile, in Holland, Mata Hari was overcome by boredom. She decided to return to France via England. Mata Hari was unaware that British intelligence already had its eye on her. When her steamer docked at Folkestone, she was interrogated and her luggage searched. The British concluded that she was not above suspicion and should not be admitted again. In France, the deadlock of the trenches continued. February 1916 saw the start of a 10-month battle for the French fortress system of Verdun. The terrible slogging match was to claim 500,000 casualties. As this battle reached its climax, Mata Hari had also excited the suspicion of the French authorities. In Paris, she was tailed by two men of the 20th Bureau, the French Office of Military Counter-Espionage. It was run from this anonymous apartment in the Boulevard by the corpulent and unprepossessing Captain Georges Ladoux. The spy catcher Ladoux had already decided to ensnare the most exotic wartime agent of them all. Wartime Paris was full of Allied officers on leave. Mata Hari's tales duly noted the stream of military men she entertained in discreet hotels. She loved the uniforms, even wearing them herself on occasion, but she also desperately needed the money. Spy fever now stalked France. Agents of the enemy were blamed for every French reverse. The 20th Bureau ensured that the firing squads were kept busy. Ladoux decided to trap Mata Hari by hiring her as a double agent. He later claimed that when he met Mata Hari for the first time, she admitted that she was working for the Germans. She agreed to seduce the Crown Prince William, the commander of the German forces at Verdun, for a fee of 1 million francs. On her way back to Holland, aboard the ferry Hollandia, she had another encounter with British intelligence. On the quay at Falmouth was Inspector George Reed Grant of Scotland Yard's Special Branch.
With my wife, whose job was to search female passengers, I boarded the ship and challenged Mata Hari as to her real identity. We detained her and removed her from the ship, and she was eventually escorted to Scotland Yard. From my experience, I consider her one of the most charming specimens of female humanity that ever I gazed upon.
At Scotland Yard, Mata Hari told her interrogators that Ladoux would vouch for her and confirm that she was working for the French. The assistant was unimpressed by Mata Hari's fanciful accounts of her espionage activities. After waiting 4 days, he decided to deliver a message the short distance to the Dutch legation. In it, Sir Basil expressed his grave suspicion that the woman he held, and who had now reverted to calling herself Lady MacLeod, might be involved in what he termed the commission of unneutral acts. He also cabled Ladoux, who denied any connection with Mata Hari and suggested that she should be returned to Spain, where she might reveal her connections with the German Secret Service. Sent back to the fleshpots of Madrid, and unaware that Ladoux had betrayed her, Mata Hari began to act out the role of the spy seductress. Her first conquest was the German envoy in Madrid, Major Arnold Kaller. The information Mata Hari gleaned from Kaller she passed to the French military attaché in Madrid. Her aim was to establish her credentials as a double agent with the French, but in this she was not as successful as she thought. Major Kaller had his suspicions and began using Mata Hari to see how much disinformation he could fetch. Meanwhile, in Paris, Ladoux was now ready to move for the kill. Time was beginning to run out for Mata Hari. In January 1917, she returned to France seething with war weariness and discontent. The situation was becoming critical. Strikes interrupted war production, and in the army mutiny was brewing after the bloodletting at Verdun. The courage and endurance of the French fighting man had been tested almost to destruction. Among the troops in the front line, morale had sunk to rock bottom. In Paris, spy mania became ever more frenzied. The hand of German intelligence was seen in everything, from the petty restrictions and discomforts of daily life to the failure to smash through the enemy lines on the Western Front. A blood sacrifice was needed. Captain Ladoux had one up his sleeve. On the 13th of February 1917, Mata Hari was arrested in her room at the Élysée Palace Hotel. She was taken to the Saint-Lazare prison. Here, stripped of all her finery, Mata Hari underwent a seemingly endless round of interrogations by Ladoux's right-hand man, Captain Bouchardon, an austere lawyer who now pursued spies with a fanatical zeal. Bouchardon accused Mata Hari of being a shadowy German agent codenamed H-21. H-21 had been the subject of a series of German coded signals sent between Madrid and Berlin and intercepted by a French listening station on the Eiffel Tower. Ladoux was convinced that Mata Hari was H-21. Later, he admitted that the whole affair might have been a setup by German intelligence. The prisoner now looked her age. At first, she coolly denied that she had received any money from the Germans. Then, after more than a month of harsh questioning, she changed her tune. She told Bouchardon that she was H-21. She had taken money from the Germans, but only to compensate her for the valuables she had been forced to leave behind in Berlin in 1914. All along she had wanted to help France and deal a blow to Germany. She could not deny that she had entertained many Allied officers, but for sex, not military information. In July 1917, Mata Hari was brought to trial before a military tribunal in the Palais de Justice. The atmosphere was charged by the trauma of a mutiny in the French army only 1 month before the trial began. The sacrifices made at Verdun and in another doomed offensive launched in April 1917 had proved too much. The mutiny had been quelled and the ringleaders punished, many of them by firing squad. Others were stripped of their rank. Pay and conditions were improved. The army was hauled back from the brink of collapse. The war would continue, but a scapegoat was needed. Who better than Mata Hari, whose decadent demands for luxury had caused the deaths of thousands of young Frenchmen? At the trial, she was to be portrayed as a blood-sucking international woman who had abandoned husband and family to live a life of sexual independence. What had seemed exciting about Mata Hari before the war now only confirmed the charges leveled against her, She was a woman in a man's world. The prosecution relied almost entirely on the radio signals about H21 intercepted by the listeners on the Eiffel Tower. But these had been doctored by Ledoux to bolster his case. No one produced the original intercepts. At no point in the trial was Ledoux obliged to reveal that he had hired Mata Hari to work for the French. Bouchardon called Mata Hari the greatest woman spy of the century. In the court's eyes, Mata Hari was condemned as much by her as by the flimsy evidence presented by the prosecution. The court heard several former lovers testify that Mata Hari had never attempted to pry secrets from them. But the outcome was inevitable, and the trial lasted less than 2 days. Mata Hari was condemned to death. "It's impossible," she cried, as the sentence was passed. She was taken to the infamous cell number 12 at Saint-Lazare, reserved for those awaiting execution. The French president, Poincaré, refused to commute her sentence. There she remained, comforted by a nun, Sister Léonie, for whom she would dance in her bleak cell. Mata Hari's aged lawyer, Clunet, another old lover, attempted to halt her execution by claiming that she was pregnant with his child. But nothing could prevent her rendezvous with the firing squad in the cavalry grounds outside the fortress at Vincennes. A jubilant Bouchardon arrived to relish the results of his handiwork. Mata Hari went to her death with calm courage. She had had a long time to rehearse this final performance. She coolly brushed away the offer of a blindfold, greeted her executioners like old friends, and continued to talk to them as they raised their rifles to take aim. Then the volley rang out. It was boredom, not just French bullets, that killed Mata Hari. Had she stayed in the provincial backwater of Holland, Mata Hari would have survived the war to live on her memories and provide a lively footnote to the social history of turn-of-the-century Europe. But the quiet canals and trim houses of her native land were no match for the pleasures of Paris. She had always lived dangerously, and in Paris, Mata Hari embarked on the last and greatest game of her life. If by sheer willpower she could convince Parisian society that her Oriental dancing was authentic, then surely she could convince Ledoux that she could be the international spy of his imagining. As a dancer, she had made up the rules as she went along. When she tried to do the same as an amateur spy, she tripped and fell. Legend swiftly grew up around her. There were rumors that Mata Hari had somehow survived the firing squad and gone into hiding. She did not. But her legend did not die, growing over the years to overlay the real events which had led to her execution. She had found her place in history. Hollywood quickly appropriated Mata Hari, or at least the Mata Hari of popular imagination. In 1931, Greta Garbo played her as a vamp who goes to her death unrepentant. The real woman remains elusive, hidden behind the mask she made for herself as the eye of the day. Sunday, the 21st of April, 1918. An all-red Fokker triplane takes off from a French airfield. Below it, the last great German offensive on the Western Front, launched a month before, threatens to split the British and French armies and open the way to Paris. Four years of trench warfare were nearing their end. Overhead, a furious air battle was raging. On the ground and in the air, the fate of Germany hung in the balance. In a maelstrom of dogfights above the trenches, men and machines were stretched to the limit of their endurance. That morning, a mist hung over the sodden, crater-strewn German airfield at Cappy in the Somme Valley, a desolate location which housed the most famous air formation of the war, the Flying Circus commanded by the legendary ace of aces, Baron Manfred von Richthofen, whose scarlet-painted fighter had earned him the nickname of the Red Baron. At last, a watery sun dispersed the mist. Von Richthofen's triplane was readied for combat. The Red Baron squeezed into his flying gear as his mechanics fussed over last-minute adjustments to his aircraft. The mission for which von Richthofen was preparing was routine, no different from hundreds he had flown. He was to lead a patrol to attack British reconnaissance aircraft flying over the Somme. A quick briefing with his pilots, a glance at the clearing sky, and then von Richthofen clambered into the cockpit behind his twin Spandau machine guns. Then he took off, at the head of the first of two flights of fighters. When von Richthofen's patrol returned, they brought grim news. Their leader was missing. He had apparently been shot down over the British lines. The Red Baron had seemed invincible. Had he become another statistic among millions? His flight had tangled with a squadron of Sopwith Camels of the Royal Air Force. Richthofen had last been seen with one of them on his tail, piloted by Captain A.R. Brown. The effect on German morale was shattering. The Red Baron had been flying over a sector held by Australian troops, and they formed a guard of honor at his funeral. But even as von Richthofen was consigned to the grave, a bitter argument was raging over who had shot him down. Did the Red Baron fall to the guns of Brown's Camel, or was his fabulous career brought to an end by a mud-bound machine gunner in the Australian trenches below him? The mystery added another layer to the myth surrounding the career of the greatest fighter ace of the First World War. Manfred von Richthofen was born in 1892, the son of a Prussian aristocrat whose estates lay in Silesia. With some background, a career as a soldier beckoned. After attending military school at Wahlstatt, he went to the famous Royal Prussian Military Academy in Lichterfelde. Manfred was a superb shot and horseman. In 1912, with the rank of lieutenant, he joined a crack regiment of Uhlans. In August 1914, the rhythms of peacetime soldiering were interrupted by war. Manfred led his troop of Uhlans into Russian Poland, but within 2 weeks his unit was transferred to the Western Front. In the war which took a grip on France, there was no role for cavalry. Trenches, barbed wire and machine guns made the man on the horse a helpless bystander. The Germans and the Allies kept their cavalry well to the rear, hoping for the breakthrough which never came. Von Richthofen was relegated to the unromantic role of supply officer. Endless paperwork and the drudgery of days spent in reeking dugouts made cavalry charges a distant memory. From the trenches, von Richthofen had plenty of time to observe the new form of warfare being born overhead. The young cavalry officers saw a way to escape the mud and boredom. He trained as an observer and soon found himself back on the Eastern Front, where he flew regular reconnaissance missions, a role previously reserved for the cavalry. Machines held sway now, and von Richthofen had successfully made the transition from horse to aeroplane. In the process, he discovered a fierce exhilaration in flying. He wrote to his mother, "Nearly every day I fly over the enemy and report. I reported the retreat of the Russians 3 days ago. It gives me great fun." In August 1915, von Richthofen was transferred to the Western Front to join a top-secret formation codenamed the Carrier Pigeon Unit, which was pioneering long-range bombing operations. By now, he had developed a burning ambition to become a pilot, but had to wait until the Christmas of 1915 before he completed training and received his wings. Back in France, and spoiling for a fight, von Richthofen immediately fitted a machine gun to the upper wing of his two-seater reconnaissance aircraft. Air combat had made great strides since the early days of the war, when pilots went aloft armed with carbines and pistols. The breakthrough had come in February 1915, when the French introduced a fixed machine gun which fired forward through the propeller. Steel plates deflected the few bullets which the designers of the system, Roland Garros and Raymond Saulnier, calculated would strike the blades. But Garros came down behind enemy lines, and his captured aircraft enabled the aero engineer Anthony Fokker to design an interrupter gear, which allowed the gun to fire only when no propeller was in the way. The interrupter was fitted to a Fokker monoplane, the Eindecker, which became the first true fighter aircraft. In what became known as the Fokker Scourge, the Eindecker's synchronized machine gun took a heavy toll of virtually defenseless Allied reconnaissance aircraft. In a 10-month reign of terror which began in August 1915, the Eindeckers nearly shot the British and French air forces out of the sky. In January 1916, the headquarters of the British Royal Flying Corps ordered that every reconnaissance aircraft was always to be escorted by at least 3 combat aircraft flying in close formation. The Eindecker also produced a new breed of fighter aces. The charismatic Oswald Bölke codified the essentials of air combat in a pithy set of rules. His friend Max Immelmann reportedly devised a classic maneuver which bears his name, the Immelmann turn, a loop and half roll which put his aircraft above and then behind a pursuing enemy machine, usually with fatal results. Von Richthofen had not yet graduated to the ranks of the fighter aces. He continued to fly reconnaissance and bombing missions, first from Metz and then back on the Eastern Front, where in June 1916 the Russians launched a massive offensive. Von Richthofen took particular note of the effect of bombing and strafing on columns of enemy cavalry. Cossack columns were scattered in all directions by machine gun fire. It was at this point that von Richthofen was recruited by Oswald Bölke. The father of fighter tactics was touring the Eastern Front in search of pilots for his new flying formations, the Jagdstaffel, literally hunting flights, which he was forming in France. The aristocratic young bomber pilot seemed promising material for these units, which were dubbed Jastas. Early in September 1916, von Richthofen joined Jasta II. His ambition was now realized. He was a fighter pilot, pure and simple. By now, the British and French had regained the initiative with fighters like the Nieuport Baby. The Eindecker was obsolete, but a sleek, sharp-nosed replacement had arrived at the front, the Albatros biplane. It was in an Albatross that von Richthofen scored his first official victory on 17th of September 1916, bringing down an Fe-2 pusher biplane of the Royal Flying Corps. The Fe-2 was an agile aircraft, but its rear-mounted engine made it particularly vulnerable to attack from behind. The mortally wounded pilot managed to bring his aircraft down. Von Richthofen landed alongside to confirm his kill. That night von Richthofen ordered a silver cup from a Berlin silversmith as a trophy. It would be the first of many. As one career began, another ended. On the 28th of October, Oswald Boelcke died in a mid-air collision. 3 days later, von Richthofen carried Boelcke's medals on a black cushion at his memorial service in Cambrai. Von Richthofen's score was now mounting, but on the 23rd of November 1916, he nearly met his match in an epic duel with the English Boelcke, Major Lanu Hawker, the commander of the Royal Flying Corps' 24 Squadron. But it was Hawker who died, only yards short of the safety of the British lines. Lanu Hawker had been flying an obsolete DH-2 pusher, but the supremacy of the Albatross was now challenged by new, faster, and highly maneuverable types like the Sopwith Pup, one of the first British fighters armed with a synchronized machine gun firing through the propeller. Air superiority often depends on the smallest of margins: speed, turning circle and rate of fire, and the ability of an experienced pilot to turn them to maximum advantage. There were many better pilots than Manfred von Richthofen, but there was no more lethal finisher. On the 16th of January 1917, he was awarded the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest decoration for bravery. With it came von Richthofen's first command, Jaster 11. In contrast to the Royal Flying Corps, the Germans concentrated their best fighter pilots in elite units. Serving under von Richthofen in Jaster 11 was his brother Lothar, who would end the war with 60 victories. Their garishly coloured aircraft gained the unit the name of the Flying Circus. The Red Baron led from the front in his scarlet-painted Albatross. In a further reorganization of the German air arm in June 1917, von Richthofen took command of 4 Jasters grouped together in a fighter wing, Jagdgeschwader 1, or JG-1. In April 1917, von Richthofen had passed Boelcke's tally of 40 kills. Soon he would become a propaganda weapon. Aces like Britain's youthful Captain Albert Ball had become legends, as had France's frail hero Georges Guynemer. These men were portrayed as knights of the air, individuals in a mass war. America's dashing Raoul Lufbery had served with the French Lafayette Squadron before becoming his nation's first ace. But none of them was immortal. Lufbery and Guynemer were shot down, and Albert Ball died after losing control in a dogfight with the Flying Circus. He had just shot down Lothar von Richthofen, but Lothar lived to tell the tale. Only the Red Baron seemed invincible. He had turned air combat into a steely science. He always fought at the head of a group, carefully selecting his targets. He scorned flashy aerobatics and dispatched his victims at the closest possible range, opening fire only when he was sure of hitting a vital part of the aircraft or the pilot. In a rare flash of humor, he once said of the enemy two-seaters which ventured over German lines, "It is better that the customers come to the shop." Then, on the 6th of July 1917, the unthinkable happened. In a dogfight with 6 Fe-2Ds of 20 Squadron, the Red Baron was struck on the head by a stray bullet. Almost blinded and semi-conscious, he brought his Albatross down. He had escaped death by a whisker. But within 3 weeks, von Richthofen had discharged himself from hospital and with his head bandaged was leading his men again. Shortly afterwards, JG-1 converted to the new Fokker triplane, a finely balanced dogfighting machine which von Richthofen claimed could climb like a monkey. Only 320 Fokker triplanes were ordered by the German Air Service, all of them in 1917. The fighter made only a small impact on the overall course of the air war. It handled superbly and had an impressive rate of climb, but was relatively slow and could be outrun by some Allied two-seaters. Its fame rests almost entirely on the fact that from September 1917 to his death, the following April, the all-red Fokker triplane was the mount of Manfred von Richthofen. Flying the triplane, he was to score his last 17 victories. Meanwhile, British air opposition was growing stronger by the week, as increasing numbers of a new generation of fighters arrived at the front. The balance of air power was now swinging back towards the Allies. Outstanding among the new arrivals was the businesslike SE-5A, more than a match for the Red Baron's triplanes. And the Sopwith Camel, whose name derived from the humped shape of the fairing which covered its twin machine guns. By the end of the war, the Camel had shot down 1,300 enemy aircraft. But von Richthofen's score was still mounting. This Sopwith pup was the second aircraft he downed in his triplane and his 61st victim. Its pilot, Lieutenant E. Bird, poses with the Red Baron, clearly relieved to have survived. However, one man could not change the course of the conflict. In April 1917, the United States had declared war on Germany. 5 months later, the first combat squadrons of the US Air Service began to fly in action alongside their battle-weary French and British allies. The aircraft they flew were provided by the British and French, since the Americans had no aircraft of their own designed for combat service. But their presence at the front gave a tremendous shot in the arm to Allied morale. Time was running out for Germany and the Red Baron. By now, von Richthofen, seen here with the Kaiser, had attained the status of a national icon. But exhaustion was setting in, and a weariness with his own celebrity. He was happier with his dog Moritz than human company. Of all the fighter aces, von Richthofen alone seemed immortal, but he had long since used up his statistical chances of survival. His aloof nature inspired respect, but not the affection accorded to his mentor, Oswald Bölke. When not flying, he worked long hours in an office plastered with the serial numbers of his victims, one of whose engines had been turned into a chandelier. The final chapter in the Red Baron's career began on the 21st of March 1918, as storm troops swept forward to begin the last German offensive on the Western Front. For 3 days, JG-1 was grounded, as the Germans advanced under the cover of low cloud and fog. When it lifted, von Richthofen was back in the air, and soon scoring heavily. On the 20th of April, he brought his total to 80, downing a Sopwith Camel at close range. It was his last victim. The next day brought the fatal patrol over the Somme. Von Richthofen's flight pounced on 2 reconnaissance aircraft. As the dogfight drifted over the British lines, it attracted anti-aircraft fire. This in turn caught the attention of a flight of Sopwith Camels, led by Captain A.R. Brown. Von Richthofen immediately latched on to a novice pilot, Lieutenant W.R. May, and chased him down to the deck. They were now over a sector held by Australian troops. In flying so low over the enemy's trenches, von Richthofen was breaking one of his own most important rules, never to expose himself to unnecessary risk. Several Australian machine guns opened fire at the Fokker triplane flashing overhead. As he pursued the desperately weaving Lieutenant May, von Richthofen was exposed to the upward fire of the clusters of Australian machine gun posts directly below. And the pursuer had become the pursued. Von Richthofen, absorbed with finishing off May, was now being chased by Captain Brown, who hit the triplane with a burst of fire before turning away. What happened next remains unclear. What is certain is that the triplane was also taking hits from the ground. Minutes later, it came bumpily to earth in a beet field. Von Richthofen was found dead in his cockpit, his hand still gripping the control column. His Fokker triplane was quickly stripped of its equipment. What better souvenir than the deadly Spandaus of the Ace of Aces? There was no attempt to assess how many shots had hit the triplane or from what angle. The next day, von Richthofen was buried in the bleak little cemetery near Bertang. No post-mortem had been carried out on his body. A cursory medical examination concluded that the Red Baron had been killed by a single bullet, fired by Captain Brown. A wreath from his enemies bore the inscription, "To our gallant and worthy foe." But the reaction of at least one British ace, Major James McCudden, was less chivalrous. When told of the Red Baron's death, he said, "I hope he fried all the way down." The Australians had the honor of firing the last salute. The fallen hero was a week short of his 26th birthday. In November 1925, the remains of the Red Baron were returned to Germany and reinterred in Berlin's Invaliden Cemetery. Another volley rang out. President Paul von Hindenburg scattered earth on the coffin. Von Richthofen was at rest, but the question remained, who had fired the bullet that killed him? Immediately after the Red Baron's death, two Australian machine gunners, named Buey and Evans, were personally congratulated by their commanding general, Sir Henry Rawlinson. But the pilots of the newly formed Royal Air Force, which had come into being on the 1st of April 1918, would have none of it. They credited Captain Brown with the kill. There was scant evidence to settle the matter. Von Richthofen's aircraft had been torn apart for souvenirs. Tellingly, witnesses on the ground had testified that von Richthofen had been wounded in the legs and abdomen. There were pools of blood in the bottom of his cockpit. The balance of evidence suggests that he was killed by ground fire rather than Brown's bullet, but the truth will never be known. In those last moments over the Somme Valley, did the Red Baron remember the bitter romance of the dogfight, evoked by the British pilot Cecil Lewis when he wrote, "The way the earth looked, falling, swallowing to stop deafness at altitude, the scream of the wires, the gasps before the dive, the machine gun,